Hello there. Hello there, welcome to this video. And I've enlisted the help of my lovely patrons here because I want to have a discussion about the link between punk rock and progressive rock, classic rock, all the normal rocks. Last Sunday, I went out to see the Stranglers. The drummer of the Stranglers is a guy called Jim McCauley. He took over from Jet a few years ago when Jet got a bit ill, and then obviously Jet has passed on, and he has now become the full-time drummer. And Jim was one of my students many years ago, so he took me um, up on stage, and I'd play on the kit and I'd chat to the guys, and then I watched the Stranglers. Watching the Stranglers, I came out of it going, well, that was basically an aggressive progressive rock band. It was just progressive rock. It was in every way progressive rock. And I thought, how are they a punk band? Then last night I went to see a spoken word concert by John Lydon, and it was fascinating. He went through his childhood, which was pretty awful when he really got into the details of it. And this talk swung between very funny stuff and uh, and then very upsetting stuff. Some of it very sad about his wife who's recently died of Alzheimer's, but also stuff that when he was a little kid and him being ill with meningitis and sort of being tortured by the nuns in the Catholic school. And I got the feeling that there's a very specific English working class attitude to almost like English culture that he cross referenced all the time, and he bundled all of that up, and he brought it into the Sex Pistols. And then what happened was is that Malcolm McLaren controlled the narrative so that what you had was it looking like the Sex Pistols were like this manufactured band, and they were no good and all this type of stuff. Whereas when he explained his concepts behind the Sex Pistols, it was incredible. And now he listed a number of groups he was listening to before he formed the Sex Pistols or joined the Sex Pistols. And he mentioned the rock band Noi. He mentioned Can, and he mentioned Kraftwerk, very big influences. He mentioned Pink Floyd, said he likes Pink Floyd, and he said he especially liked the Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, which makes sense. He said he liked David Bowie, The Sweet, T Rex. He liked lots of dub reggae because that was around him when he was growing up, and ska and that type of music. And he also talked about John Coltrane and Bitches Brew, and he says Bitches Brew is one of his favourite albums of all time, and Captain Beefheart Trap Mass Replica. Now, if you add all those up, that's a pretty progressive list of influences. He also mentioned the New York Dolls and the Ramones and Patti Smith, and he didn't feel like they had anything to do with what he did in the Sex Pistols because he said he never listened to them. And he described the New York Dolls as being like he said they just sounded like an American version of the Sweet, but on heroin, which I thought was quite funny.
Mm.
So he didn't mention Peter Hamill, but we also know he was a huge Peter Hamill fan, a Van de Graaff Generator fan. So at one point he talked about his wife and how she was born in Germany, and in the late 60s, early 70s, she brought bands over to Germany. And the two bands she mentions was Jimi Hendrix and Yes. And he seemed to have a high regard because this was really impressive. He said Hendrix was incredible, and he said, "Wasn't it amazing that my wife could get Yes to go over?" And I thought this guy is a product of late 60s, early 70s progressive rock, and it's an English take on it. Now, we got a couple of Americans here, I think. We got some British people. How much do you think bands like the Ramones, MC5, New York Dolls, the Stooges, and Patti Smith, do you see that as being the beginnings of punk or not?
Were there two punks then?
Well, so what do you see as punk then?
Oh, yeah, I mean the American punk is definitely I mean, it's just a label, isn't it? I
Yeah,
mean, there is an American thing that people call punk. And if it's different than the British thing, different roots. The MC5, they had a lot of blues. There's a
yeah.
lot of
I
blues
mean,
in there.
I see that in America, you had a number of sort of quite middle class groups that were returning back to sort of visceral rock and roll. And so there was a much more stronger rock and roll element in there, a bluesy element in there, that type of thing, and also a sort of um, college beat poety thing going on with the American bands. And I think one of the key things with the Sex Pistols was that you had an English working class aspect to them, right? And I think that's essential. Now, one of the things that I came away from this thinking was I thought, here in the UK, the band that is really held up as being like the great punk band is the Clash. And listening to John Lydon's story, the Clash were basically this sort of band that were around the scene. Joe Strummer, his father was a diplomat, and he lived in a 2 million quid house. And so, he said they would come down and sort of say, or introduce us to the punks, or do you know any black people because we want to hang out with black people, and that was a sort of copying of what was going on actually, at the root of punk in 1976, 75, 76. And I thought this is very interesting and I started to think of the amount of um, music scenes or where you could see that the critics want to champion the more wealthier, affluent bands, and whether the sort of much more working class bands get sort of demoted. And so here, what Lydon was saying is that the punk really grew out of bands like T-Rex and Sweet, the Sweet, or however you say it. Now, do you know that band, the Sweet, in America? Yeah. No, yeah,
A,
yeah.
a little yeah, I did T-Rex, I think is that's funny. Amy was thinking about, oh, should T-Rex came on our shuffle day, like, oh, we haven't talked about that in the WhatsApp chat
No,
much.
no, I love
We
T-Rex.
should
I,
maybe.
I I absolutely love T-Rex. I think they're great, and I think tracks like "Get It On" are probably that they're. I mean, you could see that the Ramones were doing something similar, but I don't think they affected the punk bands in the mid 70s. I know Patti Smith came over, and the Sex Pistols went to see it, and they thought it was awful. And then the following gig, they then came out and shouted horses, horses, horses over and over again. Sort of, they hated it. And in terms of the Ramones, I mean, the first Ramones album comes out, I think it's 76, February 76. Well, it's too late to be an influence. But what's interesting is the music critics, they describe something that is absolutely untrue. And they do this all the time. You have a narrative associated with music on virtually every bit of it that when you start to look at it, that narrative doesn't make sense. And it's like an elite that's looking after themselves. I've found this more and more. I didn't used to think about this stuff when I first started the channel, but now, when you really start to look into it and you start to delve deep and you go, well, there's a different story going on. And I got to be honest, I felt sorry for John Lydon because he was explaining how he'd weaved aspects of Shakespeare in, aspects of like Tommy Cooper, all these English things that had been channeled into the Sex Pistols. I mean, his performance was based upon Laurence Olivier's Richard III. So you got this working class kid that was taught himself to read when he was 4 years old, loved words, and he's like this poet that then took this just sort of average rock band and put in a statement, and the way he dressed and the way he looked and the way he acted and the names he gave everybody. John Lydon is the guy that invented punk, or at least punk as I know it, which is like, spiky hair and, that sort of against the system and shoutiness and all that type of stuff. That's what I associate with punk. When I look at the Ramones, it looks like a bunch of college kids trying to dress like 50s rock and rollers. That's what it looks like to me. And it's great. They're great, but I can't see how that is punk. And of
I
course,
think I think I think punk in this country though have got a sort of more political influence than the likes of the American punk movement.
I mean,
Yeah,
definitely.
there's a sort of countercultural sort of hippie beat poet thing with Patti Smith's, you know. Um,
So just the movement and the music. So television, they're I call them more like guitar prog. There she
yeah,
is.
I mean,
Amy's, yeah, we're talking about some of her favorite bands she'll want to join. Hello. We're talking about some of I just mentioned television. We're talking about punk
Oh,
and prog.
that's why I wanted to go to you guys because I don't know about every band in the world, and I like television. When Tom Verlaine passed, I think last year, I thought,
Oh.
shall I do a chat about television? But I didn't know him enough to really go and do it, and I know they're a really important band. And again, this is a band that gets put into the sort of the punky or post-punk era. They're a prog band. The Stranglers are a prog band. The Damned are like a prog band. The Damned did a whole side-long epic in 1980. You know, The Clash are. I think people see that first album as being the true punk. I don't think it is. I think it was a copy. I think it was a certain approach to things. So, um, do we have any television fans there? What do you think? Are they prog or punk?
I think they're
a
definitely
little,
prog. What do you?
Go on,
I think a
Amy.
little of both. I mean, they've got like a punk attitude. That's where
But
the
so
attitude.
to
But
recap, Amy, so is there two distinct punk movements, the British and the American, and you're just assigning the same label,
Well,
like there's something
that might
distinctive?
be something.
I'm just asking the question.
I don't know. I mean, here in the UK, I mean, John Lydon, who was known as Johnny Rotten, the Sex Pistols, he is like a celebrity. So you will be on chat shows. He's a major figure. He's not just a musician. He's a major figure. But did the Sex Pistols have any impact in America?
I'm sure they do, but honestly, like I'm not the person to ask about it. Like I wasn't
We were
I
in
wasn't
diapers.
when I was like
This
younger.
this is
So I,
actually this is quite interesting because the British people here, we could safely say that if you're a music fan and you don't have any knowledge of punk, you would still be able to say something about the Sex Pistols. They're that well known here, aren't they?
Mm.
It's like they're massively well known. They're like one of the main bands, but what they're known as is being a sort of like manufactured bands that marry. So there's a big story, but like we have reality TV shows like I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and John Lydon's appeared in that. He was on the TV advertising butter. He talked about all this last night. It was really interesting. He's a celebrity here, and the Sex Pistols. So when Danny Boyle did that TV series recently, where it was like a dramatization of the Sex Pistols, and John Lydon got really upset because they didn't. Did that impinge on you in America at all?
Oh,
mm,
it didn't get it. It didn't appear on anything. No adverts. No.
Really? Because this was
Danny
like on
Boyle,
the
Sex
BBC, when that came out.
What platform is that? I mean, we should. Is it on one of those? Yeah, the stream. So
It was
on
on
all
Disney, wasn't
streaming
it?
platforms.
No, this is on mainstream because they Steve Jones signed a deal with Disney to do this based on his autobiography, and they didn't even confer with John Lydon. And so he was interviewed on breakfast television all about this, and this is a big deal. I didn't realize the Sex Pistols were so unknown in America. This is incredible. So
yeah, I don't think not. It's definitely not the same.
is this not the same?
No.
So if someone says punk, what are you thinking? Is it like what would be the band that you would say is the punk band? And what is punk to you?
Go for it, Amy.
I mean now I'd say the Sex Pistols, but I think I've been kind of inundated, you know.
But think about American punk. Your favorite
This,
American punk bands.
oh,
And
I mean, I think of the Ramones. I know they're more pop punk, but that's what I think of is the Ramones. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of later punk like Green Day, but I personally like hate Green Day and I don't like any of that style at all.
Well, like Black Flag. And
Yeah, that's
Oh,
Henry
Kennedy.
Rollins. I mean, Steve Albini died was a
Yeah.
couple of days ago, and you've got all those bands that he produced or he was in, like
Oh.
Rape Man and all those bands that that I liked when I was
Before,
younger. Thought they were
before
great.
like Surfer Rosa, of course. Well, that's
Yeah, I mean, to me, when I was coming up, the American punk band was the Dead Kennedys. So that's what. But I always thought I felt they'd come in later, and it was a response to British punk. But it could be that British punk didn't really impinge at all, and we have a romanticized view. There's an incredible interview with John Lydon, and he's there with some of the guys out of the Ramones and Black Flag. I think Henry Rollins is there, and he's drunk, and he is really having a go at them, and he won't let them speak. You can see he believes that he's the inventor of punk.
Mhm.
But what's interesting here is, to me, I think of punk as well. The first time I ever came across punk as an idea was in the 70s when it was all kicking off. We had a TV show called The Goodies, and The Goodies had a series. Do any of you guys in England remember that?
Yeah.
Goodies
Yeah.
punk show, and that it was a phenomenon. And I can remember then we going downtown, down into my town, and then there were people walking around. They had spiked hair, beacons. They had all the studied S&M stuff on, and that's what punk is. I don't see that in any of the American bands at all. So that's what I see as being punk. But I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying I'm interested in the different viewpoints.
In the UK, to me, it was definitely an anti-establishment thing.
Yeah, it
But
was.
like you say, get the drawing pins out, stick holes in your face, zips, and it was an anti. Plus, there was Thatcher about, wasn't there, and that. So it was against country everything.
I mean, you British, Colin and Steve, you're a bit older than me. Were you influenced by it? Because you would have been
No,
about.
not at all.
No,
I was
just
a
into the
prog
prog.
fan.
We were dressing in capes with Rick Wakeman.
So what was the perception of the prog bands? Because this is another thing that is said is that punk came along and then wiped out prog, and prog was dead. And I don't agree with this. You see,
But the name prog is something that came later because back in the day, yes, Genesis, everyone was known as progressive. That's where it came from. There was the band Family. They were called progressive. Free even. I was a massive Free fan, and they were called progressive. So prog itself is something that came later after the 76. To me, the Sex Pistols were just something. They were just. I thought, well, yeah, okay. They're just something different. You know what I mean? I mean, to me at the time, they just seemed like like Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood engineered something.
that's what
Started a trend.
Yeah.
Well, the fashion was definitely there. Yeah.
I'll tell you, the whole thing's a mess. The whole thing is a mess. The way that the critics have controlled the narrative of rock history, right, go back 100 years, the whole thing is messed up. My wife is really into the Sex Pistols, right? I was never into the Sex Pistols when I was younger because, like you, I was a progger. I was a little bit too young, but I was a progger. And then when sort of people started to form bands in the early 80s, everybody wanted to sound like The Clash, and I didn't want to sound like that. Didn't like any of that, and so I wasn't interested in. And then I got into Public Image Limited, and then that album came out in 1986, the Bill Laswell produced album called Album by Public Image Limited. Now, I think that's one of the greatest albums of the 1980s, and I would say it's one of the greatest progressive rock albums of the 1980s. What Laswell did with Lydon is an absolute work of genius. He pulled in a band that had Ginger Baker or Tony Williams on drums. He got Jonas Hellborg, fresh from the Mahavishnu, on bass. He got Steve Vai on guitar. He reassembled Shakti, and he put all that together. And John Lydon's voice sits on top of it and gives it another aspect. And when those sessions were running, they even brought Miles Davis in, and then he never made the thing. And I think Ornette Coleman came down and he heard Lydon sing, and he goes, "This guy he sings like I play sax." Although the story has transferred over to Miles Davis, that's the story I've told on my site because these things get twisted. Album is an incredible album. If you ever check it out, it's incredible. And
Is that
so
the one in
then,
the metal box? Is that the one? No.
no, Metal Box is great, but it's that's very, that's I like the first Public Image or the ones before that. Metal Box is quite hard going. Now album is it's the one that had Anger Is an Energy and all that.
Right,
If you're a music fan, it's like you've got this wall of tablas and these dub bass lines and
Is that the one with Steve Vai on as well?
yeah, Steve Vai
Yes,
does the
he's
best
on it,
guitar
isn't
solo in his
Yeah.
career because it's within this thing. And Vai was going to form a band with John Lydon.
Mm.
John Lydon's a muso. He's a serious
Definitely.
muso, and this is the stuff he listens to. Now, when I met my wife, the Sex Pistols reformed, and she said, "Let's go and see him," and I didn't really want to go and see him. And when I walked in and they started playing, I've seen a million rock bands, and when you could tell a band's good. I was shocked. Well, it wasn't Return to Forever. Well, I'm not saying that, but it was like watching something like Status Quo or AC/DC. They could play. The drums were rock solid. They grooved. They were a great band, and you could hear it on the album, which is not trickery. That's them in the room playing.
And when you listen to his phrasing, it's
Say that again.
when you listen to his phrasing, it's Peter Hamill.
It's Peter Hamill, yeah.
It's Peter Hamill. He's
Absolutely.
flat in places, the same as Peter, and he's took the phrasing straight from Van de Graaff.
There's two singers that have taken their phrasing straight from Peter Hamill. There's John Lydon and Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden.
Yeah.
And so Peter Hamill is basically that covers virtually everything right across the board from punk, indie, new wave to metal to thrash. It's Peter Hamill. Now Peter Hamill he lives about an hour down from me. He lives in near in the Cotswolds, and he's quite good friends with Tim Bonus, and I could get Peter on the channel, I think, if I pushed in the right way. And I know people would probably like to see that, but again, this is a band I don't know that much about. Don't know that much about Van de Graaff Generator. When I heard Porn Hearts when I was young, and I absolutely hated it.
I saw him. I didn't like him.
No,
I saw him live and other now.
no. And then I often wonder. There's some solo albums I like more by Peter Hamill now I've looked into it. But the point is, for me, is the idea that punk was the reaction against prog is not the case. It comes out of prog and it's influenced by prog. And in that scene, there's a lot of bands, John Lydon included, where you can spot the progressive rock influences. The same with the Clash, definitely the same with the Damned, and the Stranglers for me are a prog band. I saw them the other day, and I was like, "Well, this is a prog band." The Light Show, the sort of epicness. They did songs that went on for like 15 minutes. There was all these different styles of music, long improvisations, weird time signatures. It was bonkers. I'd see them a lot, and it was incredible. The sound, they're incredible bands. These are incredible bands, and it annoys me that the punk bands are sort of going, "Oh, these guys can't play." It's like the Stranglers. What was it? Jet Black, the drummer?
Jet Black, yeah.
Jet Black was 40 when the Stranglers formed. He'd been a professional drummer since the 1950s. He played in dance band. The guys could play. They could play. Topper Hedden from the Clash could play. He was a really good drummer. Budgie from Susie and the Badgers, big influence on me. I loved his drumming. Great, brilliant. These could play. So the narrative that it's a reaction against punk. Sorry, prog. The idea that punk came out and knocked prog out of the way, that's not true. The idea that these weren't proper bands and couldn't play, that really gets on my nerves. And yeah.
So in the UK anyway, I think the punk movement was less about the Sex Pistols. It was all about the guys in the pub, and a lot of them couldn't play. To be fair,
No, that's true. Yeah.
So that was more punk.
There's
Sex
that handbook that came out. So there suddenly was a whole bunch of bands, and later on, when you get like Sham 69 and the Skids and all that. But the thing is if I listen to them, I go, no, but these are decent bands. I think that is a myth. There was bands forming like that, but I think it was a myth. I think the actual bands that got through and got signed could play.
Oh yeah, they're the ones that but I say there was just as many bands in local pubs and whatever who probably couldn't play, but they had a following as well, because it was like the anti-establishment thing. It was a way of the youths, if you like, to revolt, and it was their music.
I think I think you've got to
Sorry.
differentiate between the punk ethos, which is something that sort of like rolls around on a fairly regular basis, which is just the idea of kids having a go and bashing out a few chords in the garage. And, so you've got the punk ethos as opposed to, the British punk, phenomenon, which was, which was kind of a completely, which was as much a fashion movement as anything else. This is from the perspective of a US, an American, and an Australian. Is so. I think that, and also, punk was very different in Australia, say, compared with England, compared with the US. So I think you're right, Andy, that bands like, especially the Stranglers, the labeling of them as punk was really more of a marketing ploy because punk was the fashion movement at the time. And so if you wanted to shift units, you had to, label it as that. But really, they did not embody, the punk ethos, which is alive sort of to this day, to a greater or lesser extent in different places.
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get at least with this video, because I'm going to put this on the main channel. I'm going to do a video talking about the Leiden talk, and I think I'm just trying to push against the narrative a little bit, and it's very, very complex. Here in the UK, all the punk bands very quickly went proggy. They all went epic in some sort of way, and and the effect it had, I believe, was to take the progressive rock influences and narrow them down, which then had an effect on British pop music. And the line I would say of that was Adam and the Ants. Adam and the Ants was a full-on punk band, in the late 70s, and that line of Adam Ant slowly moving from punk to being like a pop star, and you see that line coming through. Then you have like Joy Division coming through, and then turning into New Order, and you see the effect on dance music. And so if you look at say by the early 80s, if you look at a band like ABC or Frankie Goes to Hollywood, this is just prog, but it's pop. It's been pulled down. I mean, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, when that album came out, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, is 20 minutes long and has got Steve Howe on guitar.
Yeah,
and it's called. That's a prog. That's prog.
So I was in Australia when Adam and the Ants came out, and my first reaction was, "This is glam." Like I didn't see any punk or necessarily any prog connection. That it sounded very glam to me with the massive. I don't know whether they toured with two drummers or whatever, but it had that very glam sort of doubled up drum sound. So where does glam fit into your thesis that you're just sort of outlining?
I saw John Lydon do a spoken word gig last night, and he said, I never listened to the Ramones, I never listened to the New York Dolls, we didn't even know who they were. He said this came out of glam. Sex Pistols came out of glam.
Right. So
it's sweet.
Yeah, it's a fashion.
And Gary Glitter, which we don't mention as well.
He who will not be named. Yeah. No. But okay, so there's a through line there. The through line is really more from glam to punk to new wave to new romantic, right? They're all kind of like a constant thread of visually very interesting, like sort of very high art, whereas that's the perverse thing. Prog had the technicality, but generally it wasn't actually as high art as the whole, glam to new romantic through wave, thread. I mean, I think they're different threads.
And a key band there. I mean, you got David Bowie and Roxy Music, and it's like every band in the early 80s in the UK where that was their influences with those two bands. What I see is that if you look at the history of heavy metal, everyone will go, you got Cream, you got Hendrix, then you've got Jeff Beck, you got Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, then you get Judas Priest come out, and you get like UFO, and then Judas Priest is the bridge to the new wave of British heavy metal. And the new wave of British heavy metal was like going back to the rock roots, but it's still, in Iron Maiden's case, I think they're a prog band. But the heavy metal narrative owns all of that all the way through. It's a straight line. You see what I mean? Everyone would describe that. No one's going to say, look at Yes, look at Genesis, look at King Crimson, that they are part of the big evolution that has gone all the way through music. Right? Like you said, through, and so punk grew out of that. It was the the Sex Pistols, like the Stranglers, you could almost see as being like the Judas Priest of prog. See what I mean? And that those bands they're pulling the thing in, but there's far more prog in there than you say disco or stuff like that. And another thing Lydon said, he said the bands Neu and Kraftwerk. So there was a minimalism there, But he also talked about Steptoe and Son.
But isn't the
When I was a
difference then?
kid, John Lydon was basically Steptoe. I mean, that's what I saw him as.
I can
And then
totally
he
see
said it
that.
last
Yeah,
night, and I
bet.
was like, my God,
Yeah.
all these things that I thought in my guts. Yeah, I can see a bit of Norman Wisdom in him. I can see a bit of Steptoe. And I can remember. I can remember when I got into the new wave of British heavy metal, it was Saxon that I loved. So I used to play them all the time, and my mom used to come in and say, "Is that Norman Wisdom?" on vocals. And she used to go, "It's Mr. Grimsdale," like this. Over the top of Biff Byford. You couldn't distinguish the two, So, these things. I see a very strong Englishness that runs through from the Beatles through all those bands, and then it's in the Sex Pistols, and then it's in a lot of the sort of British pop bands of that time, like Culture Club and all these type of bands, through Oasis, Blur. It's even there now with Sleaford Mods or whatever band you want to poke at, Arctic Monkeys. There's a line there which gets obscured, and I'm starting to think it's because the critics want to champion the people that they know in their elite circle. I'm really starting to see. I've known this in the music industry when I was working in it. It's full of a load of rich people that are connected. That's how you get into the music industry.
So, but also, I mean, that line that you talk about, from the Beatles through, I mean, that line also goes back to British Music Hall before them. And that's where, I always get the impression that Ringo, would have been a classic British Music Hall drummer. Like I can totally see him in a music hall act.
Yeah, well, when I was very young, we did this play at my primary school. So this was in the 70s. And they hired a drummer in, and I was really interested in drums, but I'd never seen a drum kit. And this guy came in, and he must have been born about 1910, because this guy was about 80 years old. And I watched him drum, and it really was going back to that sort of music hall. That's what he was.
Yeah.
And a lot of those musicians. So like Jet Black from the Stranglers, that he was from that. This is where they came from.
Right. And so there was no real American or Australian equivalent of that. So that's a very uniquely British developmental line.
Well, what's fascinating? The fascinating thing for me is Lonnie Donegan, because Lonnie Donegan is about as English as you can get. So in the late 40s, there was a trad jazz boom, and this was a revisionist boom where British jazz groups were trying to sound like Dixieland, New Orleans jazz. You had people like Chris Barber and Humphrey Lyttelton and all these types. And I think Lonnie Donegan played with Chris Barber, and he started to then do cover versions of Lead Belly, right? And he went to #1 in the UK, with Lead Belly songs. And so you have this.
What year was that?
This would have been 54, around the time of rock and roll. So here in the UK, we had Skiffle, which is what it was called. Now, Skiffle was like the 1950s punk. Anybody could do it. All you needed was an acoustic guitar. You had a washboard, which is this old thing they used to rub their, when they were washing stuff, and you scratch that to get the drum beat. And then people would get a tea chest and a broom handle, and they'd tie a piece of string to it, and they'd pluck it and bend it, and they could get a double bass. I mean, it was a working class. Now, Jeff Beck, the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, they all start in skiffle groups. And that comes from Donegan. And Lonnie Donegan is a British version of Leadbelly. I mean, I'm not saying he copied him. He actually did his songs. But when you hear Lonnie Donegan here, it sounds like music hall. You know, and that is key. So that, and then you see this sort of, that is the punk thing, and then that all emerges, and then in the 70s it goes in, and I think what's happening is it just goes in and out and in and out. That's all these music forms do. But with progressive rock bands, what's happened is they've been sidelined by the critics, and so they don't get their due. You know, whereas bands like the New York Dolls do, and they're rubbish.
Is that the media in the States, like New York media? New York media,
they're posh boys. They're all posh boys. The Ramones are posh boys. They're all, Patti Smith. They're all posh boys. Or she's a posh girl. That's what they are.
So the CB scene is kind of, I wasn't there, but I played at CBGB's a couple times, and just because you can when they existed, if you but not the same thing it was in the 70s. But so there's a lot, these people could afford to be in this kind of punk art scene in New York because they could afford it. They had some means behind them. They weren't.
Where would we put
this is all
bands like Blondie and Talking Heads, Iggy Pop? Where would we put them in the punk?
Talking Heads are part of that CBGB scene.
Yeah,
for sure. It's a scene.
Well, I think Iggy Pop comes out of a different line. That's sort of like
Troy.
That's real American punk. Like the MC5 and the Stooges, and they're more akin to they're closer to the punk ethos as opposed to the British. Call them faux punk. The art punk sort of thing.
We kind of took them under our wing in the UK, but there was, like you say, there was definitely a divide.
Yeah, they were.
I think we embraced, like the Dead Kennedys. They was quite big in the UK, weren't they, Andy? They got a lot of airplay.
Oh yeah, that was the band I knew as a sort of the American.
You get Stiff Little Fingers, then you get the Dead Kennedys, and you get Blondie, and you get it's like Wed's a really good scene.
And Dead Kennedys were more overtly political. Things have evolved. The West Coast groups, and then also on the East Coast, like Fugazi, like Ian McKee I kind of put that, but sort of different.
All these bands have an artiness to them, and it's an artiness that comes straight out of prog. There's an artiness to it. With John Lydon, I think there's a completely different thing there with him. It's a working class. I mean, he explained his upbringing, and it was absolutely awful. I mean, at one point, I'm not going to tell the story, but he'd tell the story of something he had to do when I was 4 years old, and it was so horrible that someone collapsed. They passed out. He was explaining stuff, and then it was unbelievable. I mean, and I don't want to spoil it. I mean, if anyone's watching this and you could go and see the tour, go and see it, because at one point you're laughing your head off, and then he's telling you about what it was like, as a kid. And with John Lydon, he got meningitis, and he was in a coma for 6 months, and then he was in the hospital for nearly a year. Then he came out of that, and he was hospital. He was like a really, really ill for about 4 years. When he went back to school, then he was at a Catholic school, and then the nuns started beating him again. He'd lost his memory, and he used to get beaten because he was left-handed. And so he told this story of going back in and the nuns, beating him again and trying to say you've always been right-handed. And he was going, well, no. And you could see that he's a highly intelligent guy. He's very literate. He learned to taught himself to read when he was 4 years old, and he got into Shakespeare and Milton and all this stuff. He's bringing all that in. And my dog's barking now.
The dog agrees.
He's not going to stop.
That's your dinner.
Eat him, man. The food.
Shut up, Mojo! Oh. I'll tell you, I'm going to have to sort him out.
What about the kids? Can't they take care of them?
Nobody will. They won't. Nobody will help. I'm going to sort the dog out. Hang on.
So we were just...
I've sorted the dog out, everybody. So carry on as you were.
So you didn't use the Carrie Lake technique. She. Did you hear the news? The American politician that sort of shot a dog.
Yeah.
I heard about this.
Oh no, does Christy know him? We shouldn't go
Oh,
there.
sorry, Kristen. I'm sorry. Yeah.
She
We
was
don't
doing
want it.
really well, and then suddenly they found out that she shot a dog.
Yeah.
That's
She broke it down in her own book.
That is.
You don't know who started it, though, do you?
We were just talking about the observation that what I call the faux English punk bands actually proclaimed their anti-progness, and my assertion is that was basically just posing, and that was just all part of the marketing hype.
That is exactly what I think. And I don't think
But
it's the case.
I have to add, because I was at that age and I believed it. So it took really hold in my mind that it was an anti-prog, anti-establishment thing. So that went a long way until this year, until I got schooled.
Yeah, I mean it's ever so odd because all the prog bands start out as anti-establishment as well, don't they? If you think of like Pink Floyd and UFO Club and all that type of stuff that's going on.
Really?
And I think the reason why I think the critics didn't like prog is because it was intellectual, but it was intellectual for the people. They never like it. I don't think that people who were listening to Genesis were like, I know Genesis were like very posh, gentlemen, and Pink Floyd were very posh gentlemen, and that's why they could organise themselves and act, and that's Emerson, Lake and Palmer. But I think the audience wasn't. I think it was, people were, getting a Genesis album, getting stoned, and there was that aspect.
Yeah, but a lot of prog bands, when they first started up, they used to play a lot of universities, so they got the title of like the student music. So your average sort of, working class kid, if you like, the one who left school at 15, 16 and went to work, they wouldn't listen to prog because that was a bit too highbrow for them.
Yeah.
So
I think, but it's like when John Lydon was talking, he was saying the bands that influenced him and the albums that influenced him, and then he just went quietly and he went, of course, there's Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, and he said it reverentially. And I suddenly, as he said it, my hair stood on end, and I went, there we go. I mean, it's like that. It's like if you went up to a pop band, a modern pop band, and said, what your influence is, no one's going to turn around and say Bitches Brew. And they got John Lydon on stage saying, Bitches Brew, incredible album, it really influenced me. And I thought, this is not I felt sorry for the guy because I thought the perception of him is that that he's not very talented, when actually he's incredibly talented. He's incredibly talented. He revised what talent was, And I think another band that's key in this is the Police, because once the punk thing comes, starts up, is the Police, which are all progressive rock musicians, pretty much, or jazz fusion musicians. They then adapt what they do, jump in on that scene, and then they bust it out. But all the prog bands are busting out. So by the time I come to music, in the 1980 was when I really got into music. A lot of that stuff is very panoramic, and of course, all the progressive rock artists that get their act together become even bigger in the 1980s. So there is a through line there, and I think that what's affecting it is this class view. I really do. I've always thought that class is the biggest divider in society.
Well, I mean,
the punks are always talking about class.
One of the things, I went to this Stranglers gig, and wherever you went, people were chatting with you. Everywhere, right? And then I went to the gig last night, and wherever you went, everyone was chatting with you. And I got in the queue, and there was this guy with a Motorhead T-shirt on, and I said, I said, you can jump in front of me. He says, and I said, he goes, are you sure? I said, you've got a Motorhead T-shirt on. And then he said, oh, I love them. And then we started chatting, and then I started chatting to someone, and someone had a Pill T-shirt on, and you felt you felt, and then John Lydon came out, and he just brought everybody together. Like, it's a really incredible thing, and that's the thing I love about the music. I love virtuoso music, you know, and I also I have a punk mentality. I think you need that, which is why I don't like all that Fusaki jazz fusion, and it's why I don't like the modern prog bands very much, because they don't seem to have the edge that the proper prog bands have. There's an edge there with all of it, you know. So
do you think part of it could be the fact that I think, you know, a lot of modern artists have lost touch with their roots completely, and so, you know, like all the, you know, the English bands, you know, generally had a fantastic understanding of Black American music, you know, so they sort of knew where their roots were, and they even, you know, sort of doffed their hat at music hall. And then on top of that, if you're talking prog, you know, they had incredible technical chops as well, which presumably they got through music schools and music lessons and all that sort of stuff. You don't just pick that up on a whim.
I say if you take J.J. Brunel from the Stranglers, he was classically trained.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely classically trained as a musician.
Yeah, so
all those guys in the Stranglers were like that. They were monsters.
Yeah, so you got very, very well-rounded humans, basically, who have a diverse range of experience and are synthesizing that.
The guys in the Stranglers said to me that when Dave Greenfield died in COVID, he died at the keyboardist. They had to go and audition, and to get someone who can play the keyboard parts of the Stranglers was really difficult, because that guy's arpeggiating all the time,
right.
all at speed all the time. They're virtuosos. I don't think the Clash was so much. Top of Heaven was, you know, all this stuff is not true. It's basically none of it is true, and I don't think we really know anything about it. Now, the thing you say about, you know, Black American music, with the punk bands, it was Jamaican and reggae.
Right.
They all embraced that, and they understood it, and then that produced the two.
Glam morphed into ska, didn't it?
Yeah.
You know, so that again, anti-establishment, a lot of it as well. And
Yeah.
of course, it was a sign of the times in the UK as well.
Yeah.
We had Margaret
and then that was kind of like sanitized and sold back to white audiences by police in particular, by the police in particular. You know, they had that strong, you know, sort of quasi reggae sort of vibe in a lot of stuff.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Now in America, you have that line through, you know, you get like Black Flag, you've got the Pixies, you've got Pavement, and all those bands coming up, you know, and that eventually feeds into the grunge thing, really. And I've been studying this, and I will do a video on this. I'm just having to really do some research to find it now. All of this goes back to a 1960s band called the Sonics. They could well be the first punk band. Does anyone know the Sonics?
No.
About 1966, and it's like everything goes back to this band, the Sonic. Anyway, that's another discussion. But you know, when Nirvana comes out, you know, with Nevermind, this is the moment where punk finally sells 33 million albums. You know, it's like at that point, you almost feel like that's the thing that killed rock music.
So he was once quoted saying, "Who's the loneliest monk?" And my mother's like, "He doesn't know who Thelonious Monk." No, he was playing the interviewer. He clearly knows who he is.
Mm. Yeah. Well, that's what I mean, if you know how the industry works, it's like, well, I used to meet a lot of drummers, and you'd meet like the top jazz fusion drummers. They talk all about technique and all this stuff, but the session drummers always make out like they can't play. Always. Oh, I can't do all that rudimental stuff. I can't do this. I can't do that. Oh, I never could do any of this. And the reason is because they have to play that game. They know all that stuff. They know it inside out, but they have to play the game. It's the industry is weird, but it's
well, it's like like bass players. No bass player was ever hired to tap you know, and hardly ever to slap. You know, it's like just play fucking four on the floor. You know, like,
A lot of people think that's what it is, but it's more than that. You've got to act a certain way if you're going to be a session musician, and you've got
right.
to not appear like you have any more knowledge musically than the artist you're working for, because of course you do. You know, and if
Is
you're
it all about like protecting the ego of the artist? Is that why?
yeah,
Like
because
why?
the artist wants you to do what they want, and they want you to do exactly, and they want you to disappear so you don't look good, but the artist looks good. That's a big thing that took me a long time to learn about the industry. The great session musicians disappear. They're happy to disappear.
They're not interested in collaborating with the session musicians. It's just like
They want to
A
collaborate.
hired gun.
It's like did anyone see the interview with Lee Ritner about how when Pink Floyd were doing The Wall, they couldn't come up with any ideas for the guitar solo for Comfortably Numb. So they hired at a vast price Lee Ritner to come in and jam over it. So Dave Gilmour could then rip off some of the ideas.
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, that was a good one.
That's a shocking story.
But-
Well,
And they said he said when they turned up, the Pink Floyd guys were listening to all the LA session guys. Because that's where it comes from, but you can't say it. No one's the industry will never say it. You know, they'll never say where it comes from. It comes from all the stuff I talk about on my channel. All those bands, punk and prog, fusion, all those bands. I've never known a musician that when you sit down does not know all that stuff every single time. I can remember once the labels put a band together. It was like a pop band. It was a manufactured band. It was guitar, bass, drums. It was a manufactured band, and they rang up my college and they said they're going to do a tour opening for One Direction. They need to warm up. Could they come down and play at my college? So they came down and they played, and they were really rehearsed, been put together by the label. They had all the cool haircuts and all that, doing all the right moves. And then when they start to answer questions, one of my students said, what drummers do you like? And the drummer goes, oh, I'm really into Dave Grohl and Ringo Starr. And then I thought you're doing the talk. And I said, what about the jazz guys? What about the future guys? He goes, oh yeah, I love those. And suddenly he was off the list. My favourite drummer is Dennis Chambers. And this always happens every single time. And they all know the Mavish structure. They all know Weather Report. They all know Miles Davis. All of them do. Anyone who plays, you can't play and not know that stuff. I got billions of these stories that I've picked up. You know Lee Ritner. This is the best one. You know George Benson, Give Me the Night, right?
Yeah.
That is so produced. It was produced by Quincy Jones. It's a massive production. It's on something like 150 tracks. When they were working on it, George Benson had put his guitar solo down, and he scats, he sings. And then he went off on holiday, and then the engineer was working on it, and they wiped over his guitar solo. So there's no guitar solo anymore, but there's still him singing. So they rang Lee Ritner up, and Lee Ritner came down. Now Lee Ritner can sight read anything, he can play anything. I mean, you can't get your head around the level of these type of players.
Yeah.
So he comes in, they transcribe it, and then the guitar solo on the Give Me the Night is Lee Ritner,
Wow.
not
I
George.
never heard that one.
See, Jones
And
decided
the first
that-
half is it, they wipe the second half, and it's the Billy Doo, Billy Doo, Billy Doo. That is Lee Ritner, the hard bit.
It's funny.